Looking for some sweet new Dungeons and Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms cards? Well, you can pre-order them all now from our sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it is time for more reviews of Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. We talked about Standard yesterday, a couple days ago. Well, Crim is back to join me today. Crim, how are you again?
I'm doing all right and excited. We're going into Historic today.
Yes, Historic, Magic's newest and I don't know, one of its most exciting, honestly, formats over the last year or so. We're talking top 10 AFR cards for Historic, and there's some pretty interesting ones, I think, for Historic in this set. So, like usual, if you want to see our full individual list, we do them individual, mash them together for this top 10, you can find those over on mtggoldfish.com. There's a link in the description. Otherwise, let's jump into it. Start counting down our top 10 Adventures in the Forgotten Realms cards for Historic, and number 10 on our list. We're jumping right back in to class enchantments, one that we didn't talk about in Standard, Sorcerer class, the Is It class enchantment. Crim, what do you think about this one in Historic?
So I don't know if you know, but there's a deck that is in blue and red that could definitely take advantage of this. When Sorcerer class enters the battlefield, draw 2 and then discard 2. I don't know. It feels like a Faithless Looting effect. Seems pretty good in a Phoenix deck. Or even better, like you could have like a Young Pyromancer deck or something like that too, right? Which we've seen. Then you level it up for 2 mana. Creatures you control have add a blue or red. Spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell or to gain a class level. So it kind of feeds into itself. And let's go with, once again, Young Pyromancer, where you can spawn a ton of little 1/1s, and then if you activate this or upgrade it to a level 2, all of those elementals will then help us actually all in one turn get up to level 3 if we wanted to, which would then make it so whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, that spell deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of instants and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. So it plays a little bit with also just like, if you want, it's like a kind of like a light storm, if you would. But yeah, like overall, this just seems pretty solid in like a Phoenix deck, just being able to like draw 2, discard 2, then pumping or like getting additional mana. Sure, why not, to like maybe go off on a turn to like get back more Phoenixes. And then of course, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it burning people out, right? Like that's pretty solid.
Yeah, I think something like Phoenix would be the obvious home for this, and I think it could actually be really good there. Or something similar to Phoenix, but maybe using Young Pyromancer. As you said, that's like one of the most synergistic cards that you can play with Sorcerer's class, because those tokens are all going to be adding mana, and gonna let you do some really crazy things that let you cast more spells, which makes more tokens, and kind of snowballs pretty absurdly. The other thing I really like about this card for a deck like Phoenix is that last level. So Phoenix is a deck that it is kind of graveyard reliant to some extent. It's looking to get back its Phoenixes. So there are hate cards that can shut this down. And one thing that we've seen modern decks do is use enchantments like Aria of Flames, let's say, coming in out of the sideboard of a Storm deck. And they're like, okay, you hate on my main game plan. I'm just going to cast a bunch of janky spells and burn you out. I think that Sorcerer's class could fill a similar role. Even if it doesn't sneak into the main deck of Phoenix, I could see this being a sideboard all-star where if you're expecting the hate cards to come in, you bring this in, and if you just cast some Brainstorms and cast some Faithless Lootings, that damage is going to add up really quickly and close out the game pretty fast.
Yeah, like your shocks become more than just a shock, right? So yeah, like the deck is loaded with 1-drops. One mana spells, opt, all of that. So yeah, there's no shortage of ways to just fire off a ton of spells in a turn.
Yeah, and that ends up being a lot of damage to close out the game. So definitely seems like an interesting option for Phoenix decks in Historic. Let's move on to number 9 on our list. We have Guardian of Faith. We talked about this one a little bit in Standard, flashing into phase out any number of your creatures. What is this one doing in Historic, Crim?
Well, so you already know in Historic, one of the most popular decks is either some mixture between, I play against a lot of the tax decks, and then I also play against a lot of the Selesnya Angels decks, and I mean, a little more on the fringe side, but Spirits does exist. And this card goes into all of those shells, right? For 3 mana, this is something that you can get off Collected Company. And then its ability to phase out any number of other target creatures you control, once again, really helps because Indestructible, just as weird as it sounds, it may not do it, right? Because the fact that we have Languish, we have, like Shadow's Verdict, these things stone cold wreck these decks. So this card is just a good way to combat that. If you like, let's just say you're not able to nab it with like, the Paulo card, right? It's Elite Spellbinder. So this just seems perfect in those shells, and those decks are very popular, and this is the perfect tool for it. Whether it's in the sideboard or the main board, I expect this to be somewhere in the 75. This just plays very well with that strategy.
Yeah, I mean, if you're playing a white-based aggro deck or a Collected Company, more mid-rangey style deck, seems like a great option to fight against control decks. Obviously, fizzling a sweeper is insane, but even fizzling a targeted removal spell is a lot of value. You like flash it in Savior's Thalia or something. That's a really, really big swing against a control style deck. So I think this card could actually be very strong because in Historic, you do have Collected Company being one of the staples, and you want as many 3-drops as possible. It seems like a natural inclusion there, and the creature types could end up mattering. Knight, not so much, but Spirits, I still think we're close to Spirits being a good deck. Like, once we get 1 or 2 more remastered sets and get back
we need Spell Queller.
Yeah, basically, we need to get back to Shadow Silver Innistrad, but once we get to Shadow Silver Innistrad and Spell Queller comes, and what's the indestructible one? I can't think of its name right now.
Selfless Spirit.
Selfless Spirit comes. Like, once we get those, Spirits is going to be looking a lot like Pioneer modern Spirits, honestly, in Historic.
Yeah, actually, it might even be more powerful with some of the stuff we'll have access to than Pioneer.
Yeah,
because Historic's funny cards being included. But yeah, like, just we're not that far. Like, we get Mausoleum Wanderer, and then specifically Spell Queller, and then we're on the map. So,
yeah, it's going to happen. We'll be getting there shortly. But let's move on to number 8 on our list. Sticking with the realm of white cards, we got another class, Paladin class. And I actually think this kind of goes in a lot of the same decks we were just talking about. If you're playing a white aggro deck, taxing your opponent's stuff they're casting on your turn is nice. Pumping your creatures is nice. Maybe you get to level 3 and have a Maul the Skyclave or an Elite Spellbinder, some kind of evasive creature to pump and give double strike and one-shot your opponent. Seems very, very strong there. But Crim, what do you think about this one?
This card's amazing, right? It's 1 mana. So, like, the ability to go and curve out into something like this, and then maybe, like, I know this is like a dream curve, but there are going to be games where you get to play this into, like, Thalia, right? So now your control opponent is really struggling, right? Like, I love control, but at the same time, I gotta respect something that powerful, yeah? Like, this is just gonna, like, make control decks really struggle, which is Jeskai right now. It's gonna slow down the Phoenix decks because, let's be honest here, they are playing a bunch of cheap spells, as we had mentioned. Once they start having to pay, like, 2 mana for each spell, that often really throws off their math, right, when it comes to their mana base. So, this does all of that. It then anthems your creatures, so why not? You get a tax effect plus an anthem, and sure, level 3, I don't even know if you need to hit level 3, but if you do, why not, right? But the thing is, I think the first 2 parts of this little class are more than enough. And once again, it is a 1 mana enchantment. You are going to get this static effect for 1 mana. And it's one-sided, by the way. It only spells your opponents play during your turn.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big selling point. Being able to get this down on turn 1 lets you sneak it in under pretty much all the counter spells that your opponent might have. And then you're really going to be taxing your opponent throughout the game. And even outside of, shutting down counter spells and making them very clunky, even just making your opponent, like, play their brainstorms at less than optimal times and things like that, all those little edges definitely add up, especially when you're playing an aggro deck. Because if you're playing an aggro deck against controller tempo, you're not going to stop the control deck from winning forever. The control player knows that they're going to win the game if it goes long enough. You just got to, annoy them and slow them down long enough to get their life total to 0 before they take control of the game. Paladin class, as you said, those first 2 levels both work really well for that. And then I view the 3rd level as kind of a mana sink. Like, if you're playing aggro, sometimes you run out of cards, you flood out, and you're like, well, I guess might as well, like, level it up to level 3. I'm not doing anything else with my mana. But it really is those those first 2 levels that are the big payoff. I would agree with that for sure. Let's move on to number 7 on our list. We're entering the dragon side of Dungeons and Dragons with Even Death Dracolich. This card, pretty insane. I mean, 5 power, 4 mana, flash. It is 5 power for 4 mana and flash and coming back from the graveyard. Crim, what do you think about this in Historic?
I love this card. I have this one fairly high, I think, on my list. Just because this is Historic, right? So we're going to have access to Jund's Sacrifice. And Jund's Sacrifice, imagine just being able to like activate your Witch's Oven, get the cat, and then have Ebon Death. Right? Like this is very good. I think this actually is going to be a huge problem for Historic. This almost like bumps, I think, like Sacrifice decks of a full tier. And then of course you also have mono black aggro, which you're already seeing run around in the format. Granted that this will be contesting the slot of like Spawn of Mayhem and Rankle, but you know, like this is still a pretty solid threat, one that, you know, kind of does what it likes doing while you're playing a bunch of like Dread Wanderers, Blood-Soaked Champions, or not Blood-Soaked Champion, but the other one, the Skeleton one. And so you're doing this does more of what you like doing in a mono black aggro deck. And of course, you know, flash, solid body, Fatal Push isn't exactly the easiest to trigger in Historic. So this gets around that. And yeah, just seems all around like exactly like what I want in a lot of my black Historic aggro decks.
Yeah, I think it's got a chance in aggro decks, maybe some control decks, but I think the big synergy is definitely Cat Oven Shenanigans. Like, this seems so hard to stop permanently, and 5 power is a lot. Like, that's 4 hits is the game all by itself. When that can keep coming back every turn, you're never going to run out of action. Could also have some potential in some of the, like, graveyardy Stitcher Supplier, try to mill over my Kroxa, because if you mill this, it's basically like drawing it, because later in the game, something's going to die. You're going to be able to play it from your graveyard. So there's potential there as well. So there's a lot of different possibilities, I think, as far as Even Death making it in Historic. And I would not be a bit surprised if it was very good there.
Yep.
Well, let's move on. Number 6 on our list. We're staying in the realm of dragons with Imarith Desert Doom, our blue dragon. And this one, I used this comparison on the podcast a week or 2 ago. It reminds me a lot of Dragon Lord Ojutai. I know it's not quite as good as Dragon Lord Ojutai, but Dragon Lord Ojutai, it's not in Historic. So if you want a big, difficult to kill dragon to hit your opponent, to draw your cards, to close out the game, I feel like this could maybe be Historic's version of Dragon Lord Ojutai. But Crim, what do you think?
Well, I do think that mono red is like probably never killing this, right?
No.
like its hope is to like wither it down slowly with Soulscar Mage, and then hope that that's like, you know, good enough, right? Because otherwise this card is just going to be around for quite some time. However, I do think that this card itself, not as high on my list, the full-time hexproof is much more powerful, right, on Ojutai. Like this can also die to cards like Fry, which makes it uncounterable, so the ward has no application here. And Fry is something that a lot of decks are already playing, even in the main deck. I've seen some people main deck Fry. So this card seems just kind of too slow to me. This is exactly, I think I have this like 10th or something on my list. And this just barely gets in, but it does feel really, really slow. But if you get to keep it around, sure, you're going to start snowballing all that card advantage.
Yeah, I mean, my concern, I guess, and I like this card a lot, and I've rated it pretty highly in various formats, but I guess my concern is we're just like in such a planeswalker heavy world now where it makes me wonder if maybe I overrate cards like Imarith, because I'm remembering like how good Dragon Lord Ojutai was 5 years ago, maybe in a world of Teferis and Narsets and a lot of control decks. You just play Shark Typhoon and no actual creatures, and that's like your entire plan for closing out the game. Maybe like creatures period aren't that exciting as control finishers anymore.
Not unless there's a big payoff, right? Like back in that standard, you had the payoff of Silumgar's Scorn, right? Like you had those really powerful Foul Tongue Invocation, Dragon Lord's Prerogative. You had all of those powerful cards, right? That would then have some bonus effect for you having a dragon. Right now, where Historic's at, there is no bonus, right? You have maybe that burn spell, the red burn spell that deals equal to the power of the dragon that you reveal. But other than that, you don't have much else. So I think maybe not yet, but we gotta hope at some point Dragon Lords get added. Then you have Ojutai, and this can kind of be like Ojutai 6 and 7 if you really need one. Otherwise, right now, this just feels a little too slow, and a lot for like the reason, a lot because like, the reasons you had mentioned. Planeswalkers just seem better, and don't die to spot removal.
Yeah, that is a drawback. Although Ward 4 is a lot. We've seen some words that are like Ward 1, and I'm just like, well, that doesn't even do anything. Like 1 mana, sure, like I can pay that. But 4, that is a pretty meaningful tax. It's not unkillable, but your opponent's probably gonna have to skip their turn essentially to kill it. So not as good as being hexproof, but that's still a lot of mana. Or I mean, I guess they can try to kill it at instant speed when it's tapped, similar to like Ojutai once it's no longer has any form of protection. But that's still a lot of mana to pay.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's keep moving on. Number 5 on our list. We have a card that has a very specific home in the historic format. Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, a new Goblin Lord. Crim, what deck do you think this might go in?
Probably Rogues. No, just kidding. Hobgoblin Bandit Lord is just going into one home. A deck that kind of fell off to the wayside as of recent because, playing a Muxus, getting memory lapse does feel bad, I guess. But I don't mind it personally. But yeah, like it is a Goblin Lord. It doesn't give haste, but I'm sure goblins have other ways to give haste. And you can pay 1 to tap it. It deals damage equal to the number of goblins that enter the battlefield under your control this turn to any target. Now, a problem that, goblins did try to it didn't actually have that much reach. It was just, hey, I'm going to try to get through and swing, right? And then if you settle me, then it's lights out. But this gives you another way to attack in that, okay, so I just got Muxus onto the board. I'm going to blast you for 5 or so, right? And then I'm also going to attack if you somehow survive the blast for 5. So it's got a built-in almost Goblin Grenade. And that's not to take into account that you could just play this on 3 fairly. It's still doing Lord effects. So it's still just a solid 3-drop Goblin.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is quite as good as Goblin Chieftain. So I think this is the second best Lord in Historic. The good news for Hobgoblin Bandit Lord is, for one thing, Goblin Matron. So this is a card that, because of Goblin Matron, maybe you don't want all 4 of them. Maybe you can't find room for all 4 of them. I mean, I think it's a powerful card in Goblin Tribal, but even if you end up playing 1 or 2 of them, you can find it consistently with Matron. The other thing that makes it especially appealing in Historic Goblins is Historic Goblins are a Krenko mob boss deck, where you're using Krenko to tap to make a ridiculous amount of goblins.
Yep.
It definitely seems possible that for 1 mana, this is going to come down off of a Muxus or find it with a Matron, play it, it's going to be dealing 10 damage or something ridiculous from all the Krenko tokens coming into play. And that's a line of attack that Goblins has in hand, or you can use this to clear a, big lifelinking blocker or something out of the way, some sort of massive problem, so you can keep attacking with your other stuff. So I think it has a lot of flexibility. I'm not sure there's room in Goblins for it to be a full 4 of, because again, I don't think you can replace Goblin Chieftain. The haste is just too important. But on top of Chieftain, I could definitely see this showing up in some number and being very strong.
Yeah, you could do a 2-2 split, right, with the other Lord.
Yeah.
That isn't Chieftain, so yeah.
Well, let's keep moving on and talk about more tribal cards. We have Circle of Dreams Druid, another card that I guess this one has a bit more flexibility because it just taps out a green mana for each creature you control. But in Historic, I think this probably goes mostly in one deck. Crim, what do you think about this one, and what deck might it go in?
This is going to Elves, right? This is 100% going into Elves. You have a Gaia's Cradle attached to an elf. You love that. You'll love to see that. You also now just got a brand new mana sink in Elves. It might be a land, who knows, right? So the thing here is there's no shortage of things that you can do in green with all this extra mana. between between Finale, just casting Craterhoof Behemoth, there's a lot you can do. And like Elves is getting up there. You give them an Azuri and legitimately Elves is a powerhouse again, like a tier 1 deck. Like, cause what? You can activate the 1 mana Elf too, the one that makes all your green spells uncounterable. So yeah, there's no shortage. So all of this mana is going to be really good, really powerful. And now they've got a second must kill on sight card between Archdruid and now this.
Yeah, I mean, Archdruid is the scariest card in Elf stacks. Like, if you ever have your opponent untap with Archdruid, it feels like you're losing, and usually you actually are just losing because of the amount of mana and the amount of mana sinks the deck has. Elves having potentially 8 Elvish Archdruids, even though this doesn't pump your other elves, but really the mana ability of Archdruid is the scariest part of it. Having 8 of that is going to be absolutely insane. As you mentioned, you can play the Craterhoofs, you can play the Finales. If you need to, you can play the new Hide Your Creature land as a mana sink. But Elves, one of their powers is they just sort of naturally have these mana sinks. They have Allosaurus Shepherd to pump to turn your stuff into 5/5s. They have Elvish Warmaster to pump to give all your stuff +2/+2 in Death Touch. So they just like cards that you want to play anyway because they are on curve creatures in your tribe just happen to be things that work really well with Collective Dreams Druid. It's so close. Elves is so close. It's like a card away. I think Azuri might be the card because
Shaman
I don't
of the
know
Pack and Azuri. I think that's like what's left.
Yeah, basically, I don't think this solves Elves' biggest issue, which is it struggles to rebuild after a Wrath. Like, if you ever played Wither against Elves, like, if you don't get hit by a bunch of interaction, it probably is one of the better decks in Historic. Like, it does crazy things. If you just are like, okay, Elves player, like, do your thing. I'm not going to sweep your board or interact with you. It's bonkers. But if you do have that turn 4 Wrath of God or whatever, a lot of times they're just like really have a hard time rebuilding. So this makes it even more explosive, but I still think you're probably right. You need that Azuri or something to just give it a little more protection. I almost wonder, it's probably a horrible idea, but I almost wonder if something like the white 3-drop Guardian of Faith we were talking about could be a solution to Elves' problems. Like, it's not an elf, which is super awkward, so it's probably not a good idea, but something like that to just beat Wraths would all of a sudden make Elves really, really good. Let's move on to number 3 on our list. We have the return of Demolich. We talked about it in Standard. I thought it had potential. It was low on our list, but it did sneak into our top 10 list. In Historic, I think it goes up a lot more in value because all of a sudden you're in a format with Faithless Looting and Brainstorms and many, many cheap spells that are lacking in Standard. But Crim, what do you think about Demolich in Historic?
You kind of like pretty much nailed it here. My issues with it and why it wasn't even on my list in Standard is because we don't have a bunch of cheap spells. Like, we don't have Faithless Lootings, Brainstorms, like combined with Opt and all this other stuff, right? So whereas or in Standard, but like in Historic, we have those things, and that makes this card much more powerful. And believe it or not, the Wizard type could be relevant. Who knows? But right now I can tell you that the ability to constantly return a threat, as we've seen before, is very, very powerful. Of course, if you add this to like something like an Arclight Phoenix deck, all that's going to happen is it just makes it so you lose to Graveyard Hate even more. However, like, this card is very powerful. Very powerful. And yeah, it's simple as that. Just lots of cheap spell makes Demi-Lich go burr. Simple.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we got the shells for it. It cares about many of the same things as Arclight Phoenix. The Phoenix deck, probably the best deck in Historic at the moment, so we know that casting 3 spells in a turn isn't really a big deal for Historic decks. They do it very consistently to get back Arclight Phoenix. Demolich, kind of the same deal. It wants all the same spells. It's already got the shell for it. I just don't know what you cut. Like, is this maybe like Stormwing Entity shows up in some Phoenix decks? Is Demolich better than Stormwing Entity? Does it replace a Crackling Drake? Like, like, how do you construct the deck to make it work? But it seems like it should be very, very strong in those shells, and to add something that you don't really have an historic in this weird like Snapcaster style effect to reuse your spells from the graveyard, which in modern or whatever, you got Snapcaster, so whatever. But in historic, that's actually kind of exciting. You don't have that many options to Snapcaster your stuff from the graveyard. In Demolich, like if this sticks on the battlefield, awesome, you're winning. And if it dies, like who really cares? Because you can just cast it and try again. So outside of a Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void, this card is super obnoxious to deal with and seems very well suited for Phoenix style decks.
Slowly but surely, Historic's gonna start making it so that you could probably just start main decking cards like Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void. We're gonna find out.
We're getting there. We're getting close. Well, let's move on. Number 2 on our list. Heading back to class, Ranger class. So Ranger class, I mean, I really like this card. This is one of my favorite cards from the entire set. We have decks, they're maybe not quite as popular as they were before the huge upheaval of Strixhaven in the Mystical Archives, but still decks like Gruul, we have decks like Elves that we've been talking about. Like Elves kind of likes having a lot of mana and naturally has it. It doesn't play that many lands. You can play a lot of cards off the top of your deck with a Ranger class going. So I think there's a bunch of different possibilities, like green creature decks taking advantage of this enchantment. But Crim, what do you think about this one?
I mean, you kind of just nail it right there. Elves is going to like have the ability to now, pump its army, right? Its 1/1 is not going to stay a 1/1. And then on top of that, you get this sweet 4 mana, like once you get to level 3, you get to just cast off the top. I'm here for that, right? Like why not have a Realm Walker on top of that? So only thing here is that you do want to be careful in the elf deck because this is not a creature. You can't Coco into this. So it might go into something like you had mentioned, like Gruul. This is once again, just enchantments are becoming more of like the Gruul playstyle. As you see, like post board, they're often just boarding into like Clothis and all these other things. So this just goes right into that.
Yeah, I really like this, and maybe this is the card. We were talking about Elves' problems rebuilding from a Wrath. Realm Walker does something similar, but if you get Wrath, your Realm Walker is dying with the Wrath. This is surviving a Wrath, and this is a way that you can rebuild your board with a bit of luck that you're not hitting, a bunch of lands on top of your deck, but in a creature-heavy deck, you can rebuild your board pretty quickly after a Wrath. So, worst case, I could see this being a card that comes in out of the sideboard for those sweeper matchups to give your deck a way to rebuild its board after everything goes wrong and you get hit by a ton of removal and sweepers. Let's move on. Number 1 on our list, we have the creature lands. Again, we talked about them in Standard. They were number 1 in Standard. Crim, anything different about these lands in Historic, or are they just good?
I mean, they're just flat out really good, right? It doesn't change a thing, like the idea behind creature lands, right? You're going to play lands anyways. Why not have the ability to have like one that can become a threat? And let's be honest here. The fact that these are once again untapped are huge, right? Of course, every one that you draw after your like third land, then okay, we're a little sad, right? But those creature lands were already entering tapped anyways, like creeping tar pits and raging ravines. But this has the upside of potentially not being that, although it's only one color. I'm here for this. I think this card is so darn good. And like the red one specifically, I just keep reading it and it still gets better every time. Like that is such a powerful card. The Hydra one's really good. The black one actually might be the sleeper of Historic, considering that you are able to exile your opponent's cards from your opponent's yard. You can play it in the main deck, and that's very much so relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is huge in Historic. I think that they have potential to show up in a lot of different decks. I think that coming in and playing untapped really is, it's hard to overstate how important that is. Like Gruul Aggro, for example, I could imagine wanting these when it wouldn't want many other creature lands because you just can't afford to have a tap land. But even if it comes into play tapped on like turn 4, what do you care? Your curve is stopping at 3. Like that's not the end of the world. It's those first couple turns that are so important for aggressive decks, so you can get that curve out, so you can get down that Llanowar Elf, so you can get down your 1-drop and start dealing damage. And that's what these lands offer that other creature lands haven't. So I expect we're going to see these in a lot of different decks, ranging from like monocolor decks all the way up to multicolor decks. 3-color decks can take advantage of these potentially. So very, very strong cycle of lands. And there's not that much competition in Historic. Like, because Historic is a newer card pool, you don't have
Crawling Barons.
Yeah, you have Crawling Barons. You don't have the Battle for Zendikar cycle. You don't have the original Zendikar cycle. So a lot of the creature lands that you see in Modern or even in Pioneer, they just aren't part of Historic at this point. So these are probably going to be the go-to, since they actually had colored mana, which is also a big deal compared to something like Crawling Barons. So I expect we'll be seeing a lot of this cycle in Historic.
I'm like, wow. And also, by the way, once again, the Elves mana sink, there it is. Also, Den of the Bugbears Goblins. Goblins can have a new creature on type, like creature land. So, kind of wild.
Yeah. That is definitely kind of wild. Lair of the Hydra also seems really good in ramp decks. If you're playing Nissa ramp decks or whatever, where you have so much mana floating around, this can be a really massive creature to close out the game. But yeah, so creature lands, definitely good. On that note, that brings us to the end of our top 10 Adventures in the Forgotten Realms cards for Historic. So, Crim, thanks for hanging out and doing it. It's always a blast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me again, Seth.
And thanks to everyone for watching. So let us know what you think. You've seen our top 10. What are you hyped for Historic? What did we get right? What did we get wrong? Let us know in the comments, and we'll be back tomorrow, a couple days, to talk about our top 10 cards from AFR for Modern. So until then, everyone, have an amazing day. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon. Did you enjoy today's top 10 video? Well, we're going over all the different formats over the course of the next week, so make sure to check out the last top 10 video we did over here.